Yeah, yeah, God, you are shameless. Yep.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. We are super excited about this event, and we're super excited that you all decided to spend your evening out here in Swanee Park enjoying some amazing science and some, amazing pseudoscience. Waterworld. That all checks out. It's all real. um, this is Science on Screen. It is an event put on by Science Moab. We are a nonprofit organization that does local science outreach. So you might hear us on the radio or read us in the Moab Sun News, and we're also here at these live events. And everything that we provide is completely free. That being said, these events do rely on your contributions and support to make them possible. So please donate to Science Moab in order to help keep these live events happening. You can do this a few different ways. You can donate on our website, sciencemoab.org. You can go check out our merch table back by the popcorn. Popcorn is free. We, of course, also accept donations for it. And there's also some sweet socks, some sweet stickers. Luke is modeling them for us right now. So please help yourself to those. Another way that you can support us is by going over to the merch table and snapping a photo of the QR code on the clipboard that Robin is holding. That will take you to a survey where you can tell us about your experience at these events. And your feedback is also super important for allowing these events to continue. So any of those methods would be a fantastic way to support us. And you're really the ones who make these events possible, so thank you. Few quick shout outs before we begin. This event, Science on Screen, is part of an initiative of the Coolidge Corner Theatre and the ALFRED P. SLOAN Foundation. They gave us a grant to bring these movies out here to rural Utah, which is totally amazing and fun. And we also want to thank our awesome partners, the Moab to Monument Valley Film Commission and the Moab City Recreation Department and KZMU. So, and of course, how could I forget? We also really want to thank all of the volunteers who have set up this event, who are helping to run this event, and who will help break it down at the end. Could we get a round of applause for all these amazing people? Yes. Yeah, like we say, you're the ones who make it possible, so thanks, everyone. So before I hand it over to Jack and Amanda, our special guests tonight, I also want to mention we know that come out for the science talks and then kind of like leave before the movie, which is really hilarious and awesome, and we love that. That being said, this time around, after you get to hear from Jack and Amanda, you might want to hang around after intermission. We have a special message from someone who knows a lot about the production of Waterworld, and we think it'll be a really fun special surprise. So if you're one of the folks who heads out before the movie, you might want to hang around for just a couple of minutes before we start it, because I think you'll enjoy this special message. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jack and Amanda. This is going to be a really awesome discussion. There will be some time for questions at the end, so please do be sure to ask about anything that sparks your interest. And most importantly, please enjoy.
Hello, everybody. I want to say thanks again for coming out. So my name is Amanda Heidt. I am an editor and a science reporter at the life sciences magazine, The Scientist, which is a lot of sciences in a row. And more than that, I am an enthusiastic Science Moab volunteer. So I really enjoy these and our Science on Tap events, if any of you guys have been to those. These are really great things to be able to provide to the community. So as Carrie said, we're going to be talking for about 40 minutes. I have a couple questions to run by Jack, but before we start, Jack, I'm just going to allow you to introduce yourself.
Jack Schmidt. I'm a professor at Utah State University. I've been on the faculty there for a long time, over 30 years. I've spent my life, most of my professional life working in the Colorado River. I did my first river research trip in Grand Canyon in 1984, and have done a lot of work in Grand Canyon and on the Green River. I lead a group called the Center for Colorado River Studies that I organized at Utah State. We've actually come to Moab pre-COVID and ran a number of events at Star Hall and at the library, bringing scientists here as well. And for 3.5 years during the Obama administration, I took lead from Utah State and served as chief of the USGS Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center, which is the chief Colorado River Science Agency, particularly focused on management of Glen Canyon Dam. Great
Perfect.
to be here. Great to be here.
Awesome. We're so glad to have you. So I did want to focus a little bit on the studies of your position as director of the Center for Colorado River Studies. So I was curious, just to start, if you could walk us through a bit about broadly what you're most interested in studying about the Colorado. So you mentioned management, but what facets? And I think hold the mic a little bit closer to your mouth. There you go.
Like
Perfect.
this?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, sorry. Rarely do I get asked to speak up. Okay. Let me give a little bit of a windy answer to that. I'm educated as a geomorphologist. I'm educated, my work is in hydrology, sediment transport, why river channels look the way they do, why they change. So that's where I started life, and most of my publishing and science work, particularly with graduate students, is in that area. When I went to work and led the, I'm just going to refer to it as GCMRC, the Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center. That group conducts river science over all the wide range of river science. Half of the center's budget is focused on fish issues, but largely related to informing how Glen Canyon Dam is operated. And in my time there, I came to realize that the options and opportunities for how we managed Grand Canyon really were limited by the much larger constellation of the world of the big water supply decisions related to the Colorado River Compact, the law of the river, and how water is routed between the upper basin and the lower basin. When I returned to the university and created the center, one thing I was motivated by was knowing that if I was back at a university, and I'm just an old gray-haired guy who had tenure, I might as well make a difference and go down swinging. And so my job isn't to duplicate what federal scientists do. My job is to ask questions that really smart federal scientists can't ask, because the reality is that really smart people, the Colorado River is essentially a federal river with water in it that the states all think they control. And so it's pretty presumptuous to be at a university and think you can contribute much to that. But one thing that I could contribute is to ask questions that federal scientists were limited to ask. I mean, the most obvious is no federal scientist is going to ask, maybe we should tear down Glen Canyon Dam. They would lose their job. They'd be hauled in front of a Senate investigation committee and be immediately fired. So I'm asking questions that nobody else can ask, and my job is to push the conversation and expand the conversation about how we manage the river. And we've issued a number of white papers, many of which are considered quite provocative, and a lot of them have nothing to do with geomorphology anymore. They have to do with the big questions about how much do we use, how much do we have, how should we be running the river. And I'm just trying to make a difference by pushing people to ask harder questions.
Oh, that's great. And I think just in case people don't know, a white paper, I believe, is a policy document, correct?
I'm sorry. You know, in the world of scientists, I mean, we all as scientists publish in peer-reviewed journals, and they all go, you know, through extensive peer review. The reality is that that process is a very long and laborious process.
Yeah.
That is not particularly responsive to management decisions in real time. So we've inverted that. We get peer review, but then we just publish it ourselves on a website. That's a white paper. Now, our most recent white paper, which was released about a year and a half ago and created quite a storm, nevertheless, where it's going to a boiled down version of that's going to be published in Science in a couple weeks, and we just anyway, it's the game you play, but if you want to influence policy, you got to invert the process, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Yeah, and so when I was coming up with questions for this talk, I was kind of struck by just how much of not just Utah, but the West's kind of cultural and natural identity is based around water, right? I think if you ask a lot of people what the pressing issues of our state are, water rights and water issues are things that come up quite often. And it's not just Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Powell, which we're going to be talking about. It's, you know, the Great Salt Lake. There was just a really big piece published in the New York Times this week, and the Colorado River. So given that you've devoted your career to studying, you know, this relationship between water and the ecosystem surrounding them, I guess I wonder, what about water strikes such a chord with people?
Well, I think it's pretty basic. If you don't have water in the arid West, you've got nothing. So water is an essential, I think it's just an obvious truism. Water is the key to economic development. Water is the key to successful agricultural settlement, which was what got the interior West going. It was the key to mining activities. And since Powell's poetic description, fictitious but poetic, a description of his trip through the Colorado River, it's also been I think it's been our spiritual renewal. And now it has a river ecosystem which we value. And so what makes this all hard and so difficult in the modern time is every historical route of utilitarian, ecological, and spiritual renewal all are tied to water. Ag is also the cultural heart and soul of the rural West. So we have extremely difficult decisions ahead of us, and it's something better talked about in a bar. Let's just cut it at that. But it's a complicated story.
I was going to say, I think, 10 questions over 40 minutes probably isn't going to cut it. Well, please join me in giving a hand for Jack. That was a really good conversation. And so we have a little bit of time for questions, so I'm going to have you raise your hand, and then you're going to yell them out to me, and then I will say them so everyone can hear them, and then we can have Jack answer. So yeah, please, if you have any questions, let's hear them. Yes. So the question is, what are some state or national policies that we should kind of be putting our weight behind that, that we should keep an eye on?
In no particular, I'm not smart enough to know how to go from the biggest, most important one to the. We need to abandon the notion that Lake Powell is our reservoir and Lake Mead is their reservoir. We need to manage Powell and Mead as if they're one integrated system. The reality is they are one integrated system. They're two parts of the same reservoir separated by a scenic bedrock ditch. If we get out of the notion that, so that's a big one. Because then we used to think that Grand Canyon was trapped with no options, stuck between the big decisions of water supply. That's how I got into this. I want to abandon that and say, no, we're going to store water in Powell or Mead to get the best environmental outcome for Grand Canyon and the best environmental outcome for Glen Canyon and Lower Cataract. Now, I'm not so naive as to think that I'm going to get my way, but we're not debating that. So all of you need to express an opinion about these relative merits of managing fish communities in Grand Canyon versus celebrating what's popping out of Lake Powell. But I'll tell you that if you're somebody who thinks what's coming out of Lake Powell is wonderful, you're way behind in the race. The other side is way ahead, and the upper basin and the federal government is doing everything in its power to keep Lake Powell full. And so I'm going to tell you that as a lobbying, expressing your opinions. If you think otherwise, you better start letting people know. You better start writing more articles. You better start moving the political agenda more. From an environmental side, I'm just thinking off the top. Despite the fact that 14 is bigger than 12, I'm going to argue that the most significant evidence that we would be an enlightened society is if, despite all of that, we find a way to release some small amount of water into the delta in Mexico and keep the delta in Mexico alive to some extent. That water has zero utilitarian value. That only would represent us as an enlightened society. Similarly, I would argue that we've got really tough decisions that you could all be involved in on the future of the Dolores, the Duchesne, the Price, and the San Rafael. How many people out there floated the Dolores before McPhee Dam? Okay,
a few.
me.
Yeah.
Me.
No, I see a few over here.
But precious, Dennis, good to see you, Dennis. You know, that there are destroyed ecosystems in the upper basin. If we want to start putting water back in those systems, that's hugely courageous. But then somebody's got to go down to Dove Creek and tell a whole bunch of farmers in the Dolores irrigation project that they're completely game over. And so we need to find some sympathetic, understanding ways to balance environmental trade-offs. But you need to start advocating and identifying a position. I would say more generally, what we need is we need to stop thinking about water as, this is our water in Utah, and my job is to use every drop of it so somebody else doesn't get to it. We need to think about what's in the best interest of the nation. Where is water best used? Where do we get the best return? But, and we need to stop death by 1,000 cuts of new water development up here. If we're gonna do new development like a Lake Powell pipeline, then we need to identify which farm fields are going to be retired and which farmers are selling out and abandoning agriculture to free up that water. We're not honestly dealing with that issue right now. We don't honestly talk about it. I do think the basin states do work together. Everybody understands we're in crisis. Everybody gets it. But everybody needs to start looking in the mirror and say, well, no, we're going to take a big step. I don't know, not a great answer, but something.
Well, certainly, think about where you stand and how you can advocate for change.
I do think, to the degree that I'm going to stereotype you as a crowd that mostly is concerned about river environments, you need to articulate what you want. We do not have a clear, articulate vision for what we want in Grand Canyon. We don't have a clear, articulate vision of the balance between Powell and Grand Canyon as resources. We don't have an articulate vision of what we want in Dinosaur. You guys need to start doing a better job of articulating those visions and communicating those challenges to your customers.
Go forth. Great, thank you for that question. Other questions? She broke the seal. The first question is always the hardest. Yes, thank you.
Maybe a little deeper about the pipeline and the policies around the pipeline.
The question is, you're asking for more details about the politics of the
thank
pipeline.
God I'm on phase retirement, and if I get fired, it's not much. Okay. Let's look at this both sides. Let's just lay out some numbers first. The pipeline has a capacity of 86,000 acre-feet per year. The objective release out of Glen Canyon going downstream is 8.23 million. Okay? So to use round numbers, the Lake Powell pipeline is 1% of what would go through Grand Canyon. So I'm not a smart enough scientist to ever measure that effect. So I'm going to tell you that's a non-effect to Grand Canyon. I will tell you the issue is death by 1,000 cuts, and you got to start stopping. But I'll tell you that I don't think the issue is, the Colorado River is running out of water. Yes, we just laid it out. The Lake Powell pipeline, to supply it, is going to involve retiring water from agriculture and retiring water from coal-fired generating plants. Because realize that there isn't a coal-fired generating plant in the upper basin that's going to be renewed and keep going. I mean, maybe the San Juan power plant at Farmington if the Navajos buy it. But Huntington, Hunter, Hayden up on the Yampa, their days are numbered. That's going to free up a fair bit of water. St. George people are up there already talking to PPL about what's going to happen to that water. So the Lake Powell, so I would just argue that the discussion about the Lake Powell pipeline ought to be full disclosure. Tell us where you're going to get the water. Don't pretend that you're just going to get the water by extra water. That isn't the way. And if you're going to be buying ag rights from somebody else, tell the people in the Uinta Basin that's what you're going to do and let them, do that. I think the issue for the Lake Powell pipeline is mostly that it fuels growth. And would you want to live in St. George if the population doubles with more water? And I'm going to guess that every person who lives in Moab doesn't want to live in St. George. So, but that's a growth issue. It's not a water supply issue. I would argue Lake Powell pipeline is an issue of growth in Washington County, not an issue of is there water. The is there water issue is going to come from who you retire the water rights from. But I'm sure there are others who would portray differently, and that's just my opinion.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we're getting into the right light zone for our movie, but are there any other questions we'd like to run by Jack? No. Okay, well then, again, please join me one more time in a round of applause. Thank you so much. Yeah, of course. Yeah. And so, as we mentioned at the beginning, we're going to have a brief 5 to 10 minute intermission if you need to use the restroom or get some popcorn. But then, yes, do stick around because we have something very exciting to share in about 5 to 10 minutes. Thanks.
And rivers. And that creates conflict and shared interests but different outcomes or
Absolutely.
desired outcomes.
Yeah. And of course, being in this part of the world, we're in Edward Abbey territory, and he was pretty much involved in the Glen Canyon Dam. Yeah, so before we get to talking about Lake Powell specifically, I wanted to talk a little bit to set the scene about the water in this part of the world. So what are the sources that are feeding into the Colorado that are impacting where we are now?
Well, the thing, geographers, it might be an outdated term, but I think it's a useful term. Geographers refer to rivers like the Grand River, right? The Grand River is out there. The state of Colorado hijacked it and decided to call it the Colorado River, and now we're stuck calling it the Colorado River. Until the 1920s, it was the Grand River and the Green River, and they joined at the confluence to form the Colorado River. But now the Colorado River is out there. These rivers, the Green, the Colorado, the San Juan, and the main stem of the Colorado, all the way down to the Sea of Cortez, are what geographers call exotic rivers. They carry water from a distant region where the water comes from across a parched and arid land to somewhere else. And for more than a century, the earliest writings about the Colorado River acknowledged that the Colorado River, even more than a century ago, was referred to as America's Nile. And that's what this is. It's just upside down, right? The Nile comes from equatorial Africa and the highlands of Ethiopia and then flows across the parched, dry areas of the Sahel and the Sahara Desert. But that water sustained one of the great civilizations of human history. And in the same way, that's the Colorado River. The Colorado River carries distant snowpack from distant mountains. Virtually all of the water in that river is Rocky Mountain snowmelt water. It just happens to be crossing here. And where is that water headed? From a utilitarian standpoint, it's headed to the lowest most end, where there have been large diversions since 1905. So in that sense, this landscape here, ironically, is completely disconnected. I mean, the amount of water coming out of Mill Creek is trivial. But one thing that gives the Colorado River its very distinctive attributes is its sediment load. And the river back in the Rockies is crystal clear. All of the sediment comes from these dry ephemeral washes that flood in the monsoon season. So essentially the sediment, which gives rise to the river form, which gives rise to the habitat, that all comes from the Colorado Plateau, and that's what gets deposited in Lake Powell, forms the deltas in Lake Mead, and then we release water into Grand Canyon that's crystal clear. It shouldn't be crystal clear. It causes changes. So we're really here connected to the river more by the delivery of sediment, not the delivery of water.
Oh, that's interesting. I had no idea about that. So I think the common thread that kind of weaves through all of these stories about water in the West is a lack of water. And so I wanted to talk briefly about how water use has changed perhaps in the last century leading up to where we are today and what the state of water in this region is now.
A couple simple numbers to keep in mind. And these are hard-won numbers that I've sort of put together over time from various reclamation reports, things that are published. So if you add up all the consumptive uses of the upper Colorado River Basin, the estimated evaporation from Powell and upper basin reservoirs, the consumptive uses to California, Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico, plus evaporation losses from Lake Mead, in the 21st century, that number is a number like 14 million acre feet per year. Now, that's a meaningless unit. So 14 doesn't mean anything to you, to us, unless I tell you that the mean annual natural flow of the river means reclamation's estimate of the natural yield of water from the Rocky Mountains, the Uintas, the high plateaus, the springs inside the Grand Canyon itself, for that same 20-year period of the 21st century, the mean annual flow of the river has been 12.4 million acre feet. And we don't need slides or a whiteboard for you to know that 12 is a smaller number than 14. Sustained over a 20-year period. So if you're a guide and somebody asks you, how the hell did we get into this circumstance? Just remember 12 and 14, okay? So then you could say, well, how in the world do you sustain that for 20 years? And the way you sustain that for 20 years is that the reservoirs were full in 2000. And so essentially we've drained the bank account for 20 years. And we sustained we sustained spending more than our income. And why are we in this crisis? I mean, it's dry this year. It was dry last year, yes. That makes it worse. But the reality is we've been draining the bank account for 20 years. And so if we then have nothing in the bank account, but we're sort of saying to ourselves, well, we're okay because next year it's going to snow a lot in the Rockies. Then when it doesn't, then you're really in a world of hurt because you got nothing left. And so we're in the crisis now because of that. So let's just keep it. I mean, there's been a slow increase in consumptive use. It peaked in 2003. There's many other details, but just remember 12 and 14.
I feel like that gives a new meaning to the phrase rainy day fund that we have spent away. But you were talking about the reservoirs and the reservoirs being full, which they are now no longer. So this leads into our discussion of Lake Powell and Glen Canyon Dam, which was the focus of this talk. So I don't necessarily think we have time to talk about the whole long history, but I was curious about what was the goal in building that dam, and were there conversations that were happening even then to suggest that we might run into the problems that we have now?
Now, Moab's a really knowledgeable crowd, and I'm a little bit, there's probably someone sitting out here who knows more than me. So in the spirit of conversation, if I get something wrong, I'm okay to be wrong, and somebody out there can correct me.
Just yell.
I'm going to say that when Glen Canyon Dam, well, first off, most everybody's read Cadillac Desert. Everybody knows the phrase cash register dams. We know that Reclamation wanted to establish a number of dams that were large producers of hydroelectric power, that the revenues from that hydroelectric power would pay for what were called the cooperating projects. And so essentially you would use a high revenue production of electricity at the dams to then fund ag and water diversion projects. Central Utah Project, Animas La Plata, and others in the Upper Basin. And some of those were woefully uneconomic. And Mark Reisner said in Cadillac Desert, he used the analogy, it was as if you had a corporation and you had some divisions of the company that made gobs of profit and others were losers. And your strategy for running a business was simply that you tried to break even for the whole corporation, and the winners balance the losers, as opposed to just jettisoning the losers. So to some extent, it was hydropower. But the reality is, Lake Powell doubled the diversions. I'm sorry. Lake Powell essentially doubled the storage in the watershed. So again, let's couple round numbers. Total reservoir storage in the whole watershed is a number like 60 million acre feet. Okay? Mead is 25. Powell is 25. Everything else is 10. So every other reservoir is peanuts compared to Powell and Mead. Powell and Mead is everything. And the truth of the matter is that the basin wanted to double its water storage for water supply. We always talk about cash register dams, but guaranteeing that accumulation of more water storage has always been part of the deal. Now, it's an utterly confusing and convoluted concept. We're all river people. We all know where Lee's Ferry is. We all know that the compact point, the division between the upper and lower basin, is a mile downstream of the confluence of the Paria and the Colorado. When we launch on a Grand Canyon trip, we're in the upper basin. When we go through Paria Riffle, we're in the upper basin. When we go down some arbitrary mile below that, we're suddenly in the lower basin. And essentially, the storage in Lake Powell is meant to buffer water development up here so that you could say, well, even in an extreme drought, we're going to keep using water upstream of us here, and the lower basin will get the water out of Powell. That's the insurance, and that's the real reason for Powell. That concept doesn't work when Powell's empty. But the other thing to keep in mind is that's sort of a bank account, accounting sort of way to think about managing a river. The reality is, to the degree that Powell is the upper basin's river, it's at the furthest downstream end of the upper basin. There's not one, well, City of Page is the only entity taking water out of Lake Powell. So essentially, the horses left the barn by the time the water gets to Lake Powell, but we still sort of have thought about Powell as the upper basin's reservoir and Mead as the lower basin's reservoir. And it's supposed to insulate the upper basin so it can do whatever it wants to, even in dry times. The concept doesn't work when Powell's empty.
Are there more people that are represented in the upper basin than the lower basin?
If you take there's 7 basin states, right? 3 in the lower basin, California, Arizona, Nevada. 4 in the upper basin. If you take the total population of those 7 states, 80% of the population lives in the lower basin. 80% of the population lives in California, 40 million people. Arizona, 7 million. Phoenix, 5th largest city in the United States. LA, 2nd largest city. No, way more people live in the lower basin.
I understand. Okay, well, so what we risk by water going so low in the dam is that it will no longer be able to generate hydroelectric power. And I guess I wonder, there's been a lot of contention about this dam from the start. And essentially I've heard that what was lost when they built it, which was Glen Canyon, was extremely beautiful. And so one of the arguments for why it's nice that this is happening, other than the loss of hydroelectric power, is that this space is now it's kind of reemerging as the lake dries up. I was curious if you've been down there and if you've seen it and what it looks like down there right now.
Well, it would be presumptuous for me to tell a crowd in Moab, Utah, what's lost in Glen Canyon. I mean, that would be offensive for me to tell you what you all know. we all know the majesty of Glen Canyon. We all know the renewal of it. I have been privileged to join Mike Dehoff and the group and Pete Lefebvre from the Returning Rapids Project, and I've been on 2 trips with them to look at the emerging rapids in Lower Cataract Canyon. At the end of this coming week, I'm going to go out on the reservoir with Glen Canyon Institute, and we're going to run down to Cathedral in the Desert and Gregory Natural Bridge. I haven't been there. I've been coming down here. This is complicated. This is complicated. And there's 3 pieces of this, for whatever it's worth, not 2. Yes, if we lose hydropower, we're 44 feet above minimum power pool right now. Reservoir, I think, is at 34. Minimum power pool is 3490. You know, is that the end of the world? I talked to a lot of people, including good friends of mine in the Western Area Power Administration. It's not the end of the world. I mean, the world will survive without that electricity. There'll be hard decisions to make. That's a real thing, though. I don't want to trivialize it. But the complication on is not the balance between losing hydropower and getting all the glory of Glen Canyon. The dilemma, ironically, is 2 different environmental objectives. The environmental objective of what's reappearing is all of the wonder of Glen Canyon, Lower Cataract Canyon, and Lower San Juan River Canyon. But the flip side is that I'm not going to take sides here. I'm just going to tell you, don't kid yourself into thinking that the only environmental issue is everything wonderful popping up out of Glen Canyon or out of Lake Powell. The problem is, as Powell gets lower and lower, the temperature of releases in the Grand Canyon gets warmer and warmer. And as Powell gets lower and lower, then you're sucking water off the top of the reservoir where all the non-native reservoir fish live. It's called the epilimnion, if you want to sound like a highfalutin limnologist. And so what's happening is, believe it or not, some fish, it's a hell of a ride, but some fish somehow survive going through the turbines. They get spit out the bottom end, they get a hell of a daze, they got a headache for weeks, but they're alive. One female finds one male in a warm water in which they can reproduce. You got huge problems. And so the world of Grand Canyon, the fish community of Grand Canyon is a completely artificial, novel ecosystem, which is a mix of native and non-native species. We've lost a number of native species. We still have the humpback chub. It's been downlisted to threatened. We still have flannelmouth suckers, a bunch of other native fish. Historically, we've had a cold water rainbow trout trophy tailwater fishery, right? That's increasingly going to be lost if the releases out of Powell are going to get warmer and warmer. It's leading to an expansion of brown trout in Grand Canyon. Brown trout eat fish way faster rate than rainbows do. And the enormous fear of Grand Canyon fish biologists is if smallmouth bass in the reservoir start reproducing and engulf Grand Canyon. And the words that Grand Canyon fish biologists use to me is, smallmouth bass establishing Grand Canyon, game over. The fish ecosystem changes. And so the irony is that the goal of everything wonderful popping up out of Lake Powell that we all celebrate, and I celebrate it, and I love it, is in contrast and is in conflict with this decision about what kind of a fish ecosystem and fish community you're going to have in Grand Canyon. And right now, the concerns about the future of the fish community in Grand Canyon are carrying the day at the highest levels of decisions. And so I didn't mean to challenge the question,
No,
but it's hydro is the utilitarian issue, but there's two different environmental objectives that are in conflict, and it's not, that debate is going to go on for a while.
Yeah, and I certainly don't mean to minimize what it would mean to lose hydroelectric power, right? That's not insignificant. That's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about just the conflict between a native species and invasive species, but the fact that the water you're drawing off by its very nature is different, is warmer and potentially sediment laden or things like that.
The water is crystal clear. I mean, the deltas are a long ways from Glen Canyon Dam. The Returning Rapids project, they've got their latest report coming out in the next couple days. You can go to Eddie Line Welding and pick up your copy. But, the river is sawing its way through that sediment. I'm not a person. Some people are convinced the deltas are advancing rapidly. I'm not convinced of that at all. But whatever the case, the river is reworking its sediment. And the deltas are a long ways from Lake Powell. But the river is readjusting all that. It brings with it its own water quality issues. But the releases into Grand Canyon are crystal clear and will be crystal clear for a very long time. It's just that they're warm.
Yeah.
And it used to be that we used to think that if we were concerned about the environment, the only thing we were concerned about is the amount of water in a river. Or we cared about whether it was sediment or not. I spent my career, dreaming up ways to keep the sandbars in Grand Canyon a little bit, better than they had been. That's sort of my deal. But water temperature and the linkage between full reservoirs releasing cool water and low reservoirs releasing warm water, that's a huge issue for the future.
Absolutely. And so I think we have time for one more question before we open it up to the audience. And so I want to kind of bring it back to this film that we're about to screen, right? So in Waterworld, we're talking about a world in which the oceans have taken over because the polar ice caps have melted. And I guess in that movie, right, they are adapting to survive, right? This is a story of survival. And so I want to talk about how we are going to have to adapt to survive. What are the changes to water conservation and management that we're looking at in the future?
Okay. 14's bigger than 12. Okay? That's just a non-starter, right? I mean, 14 has got to become 12. Now, the problem is, why is it 12? Because the atmosphere is warming, and in a warming atmosphere, we get less runoff production from the same precipitation in the mountains. Because tree line is rising, the growing season is getting longer, evapotranspiration rates are increasing, and the soils are drier. Last year, not this year, last year, the snowpack in the Rockies was about 85% of normal. Not too bad. But the inflow to Lake Powell was 40% of normal. That's the problem. Incredibly dry soils just suck it all up. So, I mean, the most important thing is that I shouldn't have driven down here from Logan in a gas-guzzling van, and loaded more carbon into the atmosphere, I guess. That's the big thing. But then so with that said, here's the metaphor that I'd like to give you. The 7 basin states already, this is like a checking account. I've said this numerous times. It's like a checking account in which we all we're all co-signers. We all can write checks on the same account. So we all agree, the good is we all agree, oh man, the income to the checking account's going down. Man, the balance is shrinking. And then we say, but you need to stop writing the checks. You need to stop writing the checks. But not, I'm going to stop writing the checks. And right now we're in this incredible high stakes game of who's going to blink, you know, who's going to stop writing the checks. Right now, total consumptive use in the lower basin plus lower basin reservoirs plus Mexico is 10 million acre feet a year. Upper basin consumptive use plus upper basin reservoirs is 4.4 million acre feet a year. Okay, so you could say the lower basin is the problem. California uses as much water as the entire upper basin 4 states. You could say California has to drastically drop its water use. California says, are you out of your mind? We're one of the biggest economies on planet Earth. 90% of the leafy green vegetables and green vegetables consumed in the United States and Canada between November and April are grown in the Yuma Irrigation District, the Imperial Valley, and the Mexicali Valley. Are you telling us we're not supposed to grow that? Because you guys in the upper basin are growing alfalfa that you ship to Saudi Arabia? Get a grip, right?
Sounds like California.
Upper basin says, no, you use more than twice what we do. The deal was we were going to split. And that's the great debate right now. In the upper basin, here's another, I'm giving you all these numbers. I'm just speaking to the guides, right? So the guides know these numbers you can hand out. In the upper basin, 60% of the water goes to agriculture. About 17% is exported to Denver and Salt Lake. About 17% is lost to a reservoir evaporation. About 6% goes to coal-fired generating plants. So in the upper basin, who has the target on them? Ag. Right? You're not, it's not diversions to Denver or Salt Lake. It's ag,